This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
And a 5-star show we've got planned today indeed. What's going on, everyone? This is the 5-Starr Wrestling Report podcast, the weekly wrestling podcast here on YouTube and Rumble that brings you detailed recap shows of AEW Dynamite and Rampage, NWA Power, and our newest additions to the show, beginning today, a retro recap series of NWA WCW and World Class Championship Wrestling. Kind of a project that I've had in the works, and it's going to be a new kickstart for today and going forward for the Friday show. And I also cover article content here on the show as part of our Monday edition, where we take in-depth looks at my articles that I write for the Chairshot website and analyze some of the big topics in the wrestling market, unsettling truths or not. As always, if you are new to the show, please make sure you subscribe, comment, and rate the show for me down below. Commenting being the most important thing you can do to help me out in the algorithms. And again, if you want to check the show out on Rumble, a link for that will also be in the description below for you. My article content that I write for the Chairshot, you can find that by going over to www.chairshot.com. Click under the Opinion tab, and you'll always find my work labeled under the name Star. Would greatly appreciate the support from you all if you could give my works a read when you have some time. Or you can always click the link for my most recent publication by checking out the description box. And again, that is 2 weekly shows we produce here, Mondays and Fridays. And we are consistent with those days, so make sure you have that bell icon turned on for all signals and notifications for when our shows go up. And as I said for the Friday show, we are given this new test run for the beginning of our retro series, which we'll get into later in the program. But in keeping with consistency of the AEW reporting, we'll go ahead and knock out Dynamite first. Seems to be where the bulk of our viewership stems from anyway. And hopefully I'm not missing anything with the prelim plugs. I feel like I kind of just bolted through that with rapid fire speed this week. There have been a couple groundbreaking stories within the last, I'd probably say 48 hours at this point. One of which I'll briefly talk about here with the Dynamite report, but another one that sort of transpired in the last 24 hours was this whole budget cuts in WWE, the whole releasing of, 18 more talent or something to that extent. Among the names being guys like Keith Lee and Karrion Kross, so it would seem. Yeah, because, if I were in charge of booking in WWE, there's really nothing I could ever figure out to do with a guy like Keith Lee. I mean, other than having to just kind of ram through people and build him up as a probable world title challenger at one point, but, that's just paperwork. But, there really isn't a whole lot to say about that at the moment. I guess in theory I could write an entire article about what are they up to now? Like 70-something talent releases just in this year alone? There's a whole extensive conversation that goes way deeper into that realm, but maybe that would be something that I could also write about for an article and talk more in depth about in the future. But if there is anything else I am missing here, I'll leave a Cliff's note on it on the sidebar of the screen, or I'll just put it in the description. But without further ado, let's get going with the wrestling reporting for today. So, well, before we get into the details of the show, I did want to take a moment to talk about this Jon Moxley story that surfaced in the last few days. I know I've been none too kind to Moxley on this show for the last few weeks, and like I don't want people to get the impression that I'm hating on the guy or like I think he's a piece of shit, because that's not true at all. I've never said anything to that effect, nor would I ever try to infer that. Believe me, I was raised much better than that. Now, granted, I have had said some things along the spectrum of I've never been a fan of his, and some more heavy hitting criticisms like I think he sucks as a wrestler, and I'm not gonna necessarily retract my assertions on that because my opinion of Mox as a talent or a performer is not equivalent of my opinion of him as an individual human being. Of course, I try to bring some sense of humor to the show and take jabs here and there when I can, and most of the time it's all in good fun, but I also understand that sometimes it might come off the wrong way when you take it literally. So I want to make that direct and clear out of the gate. Addictions are not things that you take lightly in this world, whether it's drugs, alcohol, prescription medication, even things I perceive to be just as bad, if not worse, in a lot of cases than that, like the main things people talk about, especially things like porn and social media. Especially in our culture today, I think people overlook just how toxic the internet has become for our society. And, of course, the reason we overlook it a lot of the time is that we need the internet to function in our daily lives a lot of the time. I certainly need internet access to be able to stream the wrestling content I review or just be able to do basic research in preparation for the show. I mean, obviously, I need it for article citations on my articles that I write for the Chairshot. I mean, I need it for a whole variety of things. In fact, had it not been for the internet, I probably wouldn't have found out about the Jon Moxley situation until the live show. And granted, I've been able to basically train myself to function without a constant need to be on social media. I don't do dating apps, I don't do Twitter, I don't do Instagram, I don't do Snapchat. I'm rarely ever active on Facebook unless I need to use Messenger. And I'm certainly not involved in that toxicity that's become OnlyFans. For some people that are heavily invested into that community, please feel free to reach out in the comments and talk to me about what is so attracting about OnlyFans, because I'm starting to find that site is right at the top of the list as one of the most dangerous media platforms on the market today, both for men and women. Anyway, getting back to this Moxley deal for a minute, I wish him all the best in his recovery. Yes, they did have to scramble last minute to find a replacement for his scheduled match against Cassidy for Dynamite, and I think they found a perfectly appropriate substitute for that match. But obviously this was something that Mox felt he had to deal with right away, and good for him for recognizing the situation and taking initiative to fix the problem. Not sure how long he's going to be out, but the way I see it, his health is way more important right now. And the opening match was Kenny Omega versus Alan Angels of the Dark Order. And I'll tell you one thing right out of the gate that I did not mentally prepare myself for going into the show was Justin Roberts' ring announcing. And just so you don't presume it's an AEW thing, no, trust me, I couldn't stand him in WWE either. Once they replaced my main man, Tony Chimmel, that was about the end of WWE's great list of ring announcers. No offense to Lillian Garcia. Anyway, they had a match. I had no idea why it was as competitive as it was. They actually let this Dark Order guy get multiple visual pins on the world champion here. And if I had any rhyme or reason to believe that Alan Angels was going to A, ever be AEW World Champion, or B, elevate up the card to a semi-main or main event role in the next 3 to 5 years, I may have been alright with this match being as back and forth as it was, And, well, I can't guarantee for 100% certainty that they wouldn't decide to elevate a generic bald indie guy like Angels in several years. Fuck, with AEW, nothing really surprises me at this point. Nonetheless, I am of the opinion that this match should not have been as competitive as it was. So after the bell, Kenny gets on the stick and teases he's going to drop Allen on a chair with the one-winged angel. And that is when Hangman Page, I wrote down ran out, but I think it'd be more accurate to say that he sauntered down to the ring. And it was nice to see that he showed up this week in regular street clothes as opposed to the fucking Stay Puffed Marshmallow Man. And he teased the buckshot on Kenny, but Kenny ducked it and bounced. And Page just said Omega's got 10 days left as champion. And had I been able to erase the stain of last week's main event, I probably would have at least been able to say solid enough build for the title match of the pay-per-view, but God, at this point, they're going to need to pull off a miracle to get me to want to see Page win that world title at Full Gear. We had a Malachi Black skit talking about Julius Caesar and apparently being barred from ringside for the Cody Andrade match and something to that effect. And out next for his obligatory Dynamite promo in Seg 2, as I've laid out as a repeated formula AEW settled on, here comes CM Punk. And he actually ended up cutting a hell of a promo here, all things considered. He just spent a minute talking about the Jon Moxley story, wishing him all the best, blah, blah. And he says that Eddie Kingston's not there, but he wants him to show up on Rampage Friday because he has some ass-splaining to do. And by that, I mean Punk wants an apology for disrespecting him in his interview with Tony last week. And if I were a betting man, I don't think Punk is getting his demanded apology. And by the way, I touched on this a little after the Kingston Punk confrontation on Rampage, but for sake of reiterating, I'll just say this. My presumption here is that the match between the two for Full Gear is just going to be like a one-and-done blow-off with Punk probably going over in the end. And I guess the way I look at it, if they had brought Punk in with more pre-planned ideas for his booking instead of a brief dream match with him and Darby Allin and then a bunch of subsequent TV matches with mid-card guys, I probably would have been all right with the one-and-done deal, but God, Punk has just felt like such an underwhelming part of the show for a while now. I really think they need to stretch this out longer. Because whether or not people want to admit this or not, it's time to wake up, people, and jump off the bandwagon. Let's try to be practical for a minute and quit reviewing this through the Cody Rhodes artificial reality lens. Punk is cold right now. He's a jag, he's completely directionless, and while Tony might have an idea of what he wants to do with Punk a year down the road from now, although I highly doubt it, what they're currently doing with him right now is not sticking. A long-term program with Punk and Kingston that bleeds over into next year is really something that both guys could use at this point. Because even with a guy like Kingston, I mean, as great as he is on the stick, he hasn't exactly lit the world on fire in AEW since his debut either. I mean, they really need a major course correction right now because both of these guys are talented enough to be able to make an extended program work. So, hopefully it's something Tony's considering as he's projecting where he wants to be 3 to 5 months down the road. Had a quick deal with Miro here. Basically just let everyone know he's replacing Moxley in the main event, which I definitely had no objections to at all. Then we had this Beta Bucks Adam Cole promo backstage with Marvez. And Cole basically opens up by saying that last week's 8-man was a fluke and that it'll never happen again. A fluke, you say? That's a word to describe it. And by the way, you're damn right it'll never happen again, because if Tony Khan wants to prove he has any shred of credibility as a booker at this point, he'll do everything in his power to disassociate himself from that garbage Halloween fuckfest. Anyway, to make a long story short here, the heels are doing some dialogue when Christian Cage and Luchasaurus show up and get into blows with the heels, and they end up fighting out into the arena, and somewhere in this mess, Jungle Boy does a flip dive off the stage and barrels over the heels, seeming perfectly fine after having been thrown off a stage just a week and a half prior, whenever it was. But guess I shouldn't really be surprised that he was back no selling everything not too long after the fact. Anyway, so fast forward to the end, babyfaces are just totally beating the shit out of the Elite, which in the back of my mind I'm thinking, how exactly am I being induced to seeing the babyfaces get their revenge on pay-per-view when they're just giving it to me on free television? And right as this thought about entered my mind, Jungle Boy puts Adam Cole in the snare trap and leaves him for dead at the top of the stage. Christian Cage comes out with 2 chairs and gives Cole a concerto and effectively kills him right then and there. And I'll speak more on that whole deal later on, because AEW made sure that they didn't disappoint with their weekly dose of head-throbbing stupidity. But, yes, a wrestling angle that at one point in the business would have been an automatic career ender was just another part of the show. There were no EMTs, there was no stretcher job, there was no ambulance angle, there was no announcer update on the medical status throughout the night on Cole. Nope. In fact, I'm pretty sure Tony Schiavone just sold it as, man, it's going to be hard for the Elite to make their comeback at Full Gear now. Great sell, Tony. Glad to know you've pretty much phoned it in at this point. So that was that skit. Man gets his head fucking caved in with a chair, and in the modern era of pro wrestling, it is just another part of the show. So then we get this Aerostar and the former Kalisto of WWE fame versus FTR in a tag match for the AAA belts, I think. Totally forgot the name of the former Kalisto off the top of my head. I wrote it down somewhere in my notes. Just scrolling down a bit to see. Oh yeah, Samurai del Sol. That's right. Yeah, did WWE ever miss the boat with that guy? I mean, I guess with Ray still being around, they probably figured there wasn't much of a need for him, but I think we all forget just how over that dude was in WWE at one point. Anyhow, I would say the match was going relatively passable per AEW standards, and then for some reason that I cannot conceive of, that Aerostar idiot tried for some flip dive to Dax on the outside and rammed his ankle into the guardrail and basically ate shit. So, of course, he's visibly limping for the remainder of the match, trying to power through what was an obvious injury. And I give him credit for trying to keep going, but you could definitely tell it threw off the psychology for a lot of the remainder of the match. And they're doing moves for a while, and finally Cash ended up using the ropes to steal the win. And that's about the extent of what my notes read here. I guess there is a part of me that's a little intrigued in seeing the Lucha Bros FTR match at the pay-per-view. One, to see if they actually have FTR win the straps, which I'm not betting money on right now. And 2, to see if they can actually pry a good match out of Phoenix and Pentagon for a change. Because Lord knows after that fucking cage match with them and the Beta Bucks, I could really use a good tag cleanser right now. Yeah, and I at least have enough confidence that Dax and Cash could carry that match to something semi-watchable. And we had this Inner Circle Top Team segment, which, albeit still hasn't really struck a chord with me. I mean, by far the best part of this entire feud has been watching Jericho roast Paige Van Zandt on the stick. But, this is the whole deal where the Inner Circle got to pick the 3 MMA fighters as part of that open contract deal for the street fight at the pay-per-view. Oh, and by the way, I wrote this down during the Inner Circle entrance. If it is true that the 2 ladies in the front row traveled to Kansas City for this show just to sing Judas live, might I suggest they get their refunds at the booth. So, long story short here, heels come out. Lambert does his usual cheap heat promo, still managing to crack his voice at various points and yet being able to get through the segment without choking on his own spit. Amazing man Dan Lambert is. And obviously the giant swerve here, if you even want to call it that, is that Lambert makes the claim that he's the top guy on America's top team. So he ends up putting his own foot in his mouth. And the faces choose Dos Santos, that Andre Arlovsky, however the fuck you pronounce it, and Dan Lambert, of course. And I mean, you pretty much saw this coming a mile away, but the loudmouth manager getting his comeuppance payoff was bound to happen at some point. I still think they missed a golden opportunity to troll Top Team by having Paige compete as part of the match, but yeah, this isn't Impact Wrestling. They're not that stupid. Of course, the best part of this was Jericho making his sexual innuendo jokes on Paige, but aside from that, I mean, the Top Team picks never really made a lick of difference for me anyway. I just really haven't dug this feud from the beginning, and like the whole street fight thing isn't really making it any more enticing for me. In fact, if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, the street fight stip is actually stupid because all it does is give the heels the advantage to run in anyway. So, honestly, who cares who the Inner Circle pick from Top Team to fight? Like, either way, the heels can't get disqualified for running interference. Yeah, plus the whole thing's just going to be a giant ECW clusterfuck mob with like 72 split screens and guys crashing through furniture left and right. It's just going to be a total mess. Guess we'll see how many camera angles they miss this go around. I guess if they give us a proper payoff with Lambert taking a bump through a table or something, it'll all be worth it in the end, but Anna Jay and Jamie Hayter wrestled a bad TBS title tournament match.
Surprise, motherfucker.
Definitely look for an excuse to drop that one again. Moving right along here with the show. MJF and Darby Allin had a skit in the ring. And throughout the night, they had shown Darby sitting in the skybox area. And this was actually a really clever idea with the way they filmed this on camera, because with the position they had MJF cutting this promo on Darby from the crowd, like he was essentially looking right into the camera the whole time he was talking. I thought that looked really cool. Major props to the production team for the way they filmed that. And I mean, I don't really need to elaborate much on the MJF dialogue. Essentially, he just said it took him a while to figure out, but he's finally come to the realization that the reason people cheer Darby and boo him is that the people are just like Darby, in the sense that they're outcasts, they're incels, they'll never fit in with society. Says that he's a better wrestler than Darby and can even beat him with a headlock takeover. And fast forward a bit, Darby ends up charging down to the ring, but MJF hits the ramp. And this was right about the point in the skit where they totally lost me and just try to get way too cute with the mass brawl deal. First off, Sting comes out with this random army of geeks in MJF face masks, and of course MJF takes off in the other direction while Sting is stalking him down ringside. And while the camera is focused on shooting Sting and MJF, we hear what sounds like a chair shot off camera, and I mean, like, even the announcers are confused as to what's going on. And eventually Excalibur just goes, "I think that is Sean Spears with a chair taking out the masked guys." Of course, we never see Shawn Spears at all here. We're just supposed to presume he's there. And all the while, Sting and Spears are apparently doing something on the ramp, and the camera is filming MJF and Darby brawling in the crowd from the polar opposite direction of the arena. Somehow in there, MJF ended up getting taken out over the barricade. Darby tried for a coffin drop in the ring, but MJF ducked and bailed over the guardrail. And, well, Sting and the masked goons were apparently running off Spears through the tunnel. And if they had just simplified this by eliminating the masked goons and just stuck with Sting and Darby trapping MJF between the ramp and the ring, maybe have Spears come out and deck Sting momentarily so that MJF could run off through the crowd while Spears took the bullet. Okay, it's a little overbooked and chaotic still, but they could have at least caught everything on film instead of telling us that Shawn Spears was fighting with Sting and the masked guys, but we never actually see Shawn on camera at any point. This was just too much. Good promo deal with MJF and Darby, but the brawling I could have done without. Oh, and Darby still can't talk, but what else is new? So then we get Andrade El Idolo versus Cody Cena. John Rhodes. Yeah, you get the point. And to put it as candidly as I possibly can, they had a match. That is the best way I could sum this up in a nutshell. It was there. It was a thing that happened. And I don't think a single person will remember it ever took place a week from now. Obviously, Cody is still being booed, which comes off as a shock to no one with half a brain, but he is really determined to go all in with this against-the-grain babyface run. And as I've said before, I will say it again. Unless this is part of some grand scheme on Cody's part to troll the fans and conceal a heel turn for a later date, this is just about as an artificial of a reality as you could possibly live in with professional wrestling. And again, you can go check out my Cody Rhodes versus the Wrestling Fans article from the Chairshot if you want further elaboration on that. Or better yet, go watch the Monday show where we talk about that article in depth, and I break down everything bullet point by bullet point just to show you how crazy this story is. So, fast forward to the end, Arn ends up swiping one of Andrade's managers off the apron, and of course the ref is distracted by this momentarily. And as Andrade is standing on the outside, Cody goes for a suicide dive, but ends up ramming face first into FTR's AAA tag belts as they're both hiding under the ring. Apparently patiently waiting for several segments just to do this one spot, which, now that I think about it, is probably why they booked the MJF masked army to come out with Sting earlier, because they needed an excuse to hide FTR under the ring just so they could do this overly contrived finishing sequence. Anyway, so Andrade wins, and afterwards they have to do their 37th afterbirth in a row with the heel gang beatdown. Of course, Tully and Arn's coming to blows. As if. And eventually outrun Phoenix and Pentagon for the save to run off FTR and Andrade. Where Pac was exactly, I couldn't tell you, but whatever. And by the way, I don't mean to belabor it, but I did write down just how god-awful that brief exchange was with FTR and the Lucha Bros before the heels ducked out. Just an awkward, clumsy-looking fight with guys tripping over their own feet, guys doing the bad-looking do-si-do exchanges off the ropes. Really didn't give me any promising hope for that title match at the pay-per-view, but whatever it was that threw these guys off here, I hope we don't see anything like that at Full Gear, because God, did that look horrible. We had John Silver in the ring with Tony Schiavone to hype up a match on Rampage. And his opponent for that show, you might ask? Yes, Adam Cole. Adam Cole, huh? The same Adam Cole that just got killed with a concerto an hour prior to this segment. And we're just supposed to presume he's going to be perfectly fine to go on Friday for Rampage. Or actually, no, that's a lie, because they tape all the Rampage matches after Dynamite goes off air. So if you bought a ticket for the show, Adam Cole was essentially fine to compete in less than an hour after being killed with a chair shot to the head. We wonder why no one takes wrestling seriously anymore. So that's something I have to look forward to for Friday, I guess. John Silver versus Adam Cole. My mouth is watering at the thought of it. Oh, and the Silver promo sucked, by the way. Guess I should point that out. I had no idea what the fuck he was talking about. I had no idea who Budge was, nor did 80% of the crowd either. And if you give me some bullshit excuse, you need to watch Being the Elite to understand. You can go piss up a rope. And we get to our replacement main event here. It is Orange Cassidy versus Miro in the AEW Eliminator Tournament semifinals. And if there's anything I really needed at this point in the show, it was getting the chance to watch Miro beat the ever-loving shit out of Orange Cassidy and just squash him like the mid-card dweeb he is. And boy, did he not disappoint here. I may just throw this on my top 20 match of the year list just out of sheer enjoyment of watching Miro pound on this clown. I could tell JR felt the same. Of course, there was the ridiculous table spot on the outside where Cassidy does the leaping dive onto Miro, and because he's a fucking idiot, he no-sells it by giving Hardy the thumbs up over the barricade. Yes, apparently the Matt Hardy-Orange Cassidy feud is still going. As if anyone could possibly give a shit at this point. But other than that brief moment of sheer idiocy, and Miro beating the slowest 10 count in the history of wrestling, I mostly just had fun watching Miro throw Cassidy around and stomp a mud hole in him. Of course, he locks in the game over, camel clutch, and taps Cassidy out almost immediately. And that is when Bryan Danielson instantly drops the headset and hurriedly walks down to the ring to do the stare down with Miro before the show cuts off. Tony probably sitting in Gorilla going, Danielson, you got 30 seconds before the show goes off air. Haul ass. And haul ass he did. And, again, I'm not trying to demean Moxley or anything. I know the initial plan was to do Danielson-Moxley in the tournament finals, but tell you the truth, I am much more intrigued with the idea of Miro and Danielson. I think that could be a fantastic match. Come to think of it, in fact, I don't recall them ever having a program in WWE one-on-one. They may have had a TV match at one point that I'm overlooking, but as far as any major feud or rivalry, I don't ever remember these guys coming to blows on WWE TV for anything. At least not on pay-per-view. So, yeah, that should be a real fun match. And admittedly so, I know I've been a hard ass about AEW spending time putting off the card for Full Gear in the last few weeks, but, they're starting to put together a relatively decent-looking card. And as of right now, they don't have the Punk Kingston match officially announced, but I'm sure that'll be another layered wrinkle before next week. But, the show's looking really promising. The 10-man tag in the women's match I'm not really all that high on. And they're still walking thin ice right now at the whole Hangman Page Kenny Omega title match just with the way they've been building it up. But I can at least expect the match will be good. But everything I'm looking forward to in some capacity. MJF and Darby has been built up relatively well. Danielson and Miro should be great. Punk and Kingston will be a lot of fun. I'm banking on FTR being able to pull out a solid match of Phoenix and Pentagon. Yeah, man, looking forward to seeing how they cap off the rest of the card. I am wondering what the plan is for Adam Cole right now. I had figured they were building to some kind of rematch with him and Jungle Boy, but I don't really know. Because now they put the Bucks and the Jurassic Express back in the mix with Christian. And if I'm not mistaken, didn't they already do the 6-man with the Elite, Christian, Luchasaurus, and Jungle Boy? Could have sworn we've seen that match in some capacity. Maybe it was like an 8-man or something that they did, but like these guys have basically been fighting back and forth for a while now. So I don't know if it's going to lead to some kind of stipulation rematch or what, but it's a little too overly convoluted with the way they've been going about that. For my money, I would have been perfectly satisfied with Cole and Jungle Boy too, because that was really the program that I found the most intriguing out of the bunch here. And yeah, I'm sure they'll try to do some multi-man battle royal clusterfuck deal just to get a bunch of other guys on the card in some manner. But if that's like a pre-show deal or something, or even if they do it on the main card with guys like Powerhouse Hobbs or Dante Martin or Ricky Starks, I wouldn't be opposed to that either. So we'll see. The other thing I'm wondering about too is what the whole deal is with the Cody Pack Malachi Andrade deal. At first, it kind of seemed like they were building to a tag match at the pay-per-view, but now that doesn't look to be the case. I'd love to see them book Pac and Malachi as a singles match for the pay-per-view, but yeah, that's another one that's up in the air right now. Overall, I would probably rank the show along the lines of solid to good. Evidently there will always be things I don't like on the show, but their main focus right now should be building hype for the Full Gear pay-per-view. And it seemed like they were on a relatively decent track with that this week. The Rampage show for Friday does not look all that promising on paper. Like, what do they have aside from the Punk Kingston face-off? Adam Cole versus John Silver and the Bunny versus Red Velvet? Yeesh. Good thing it's only an hour. Well, I said we were going to dive into some classic content, and that we will. Particularly this World Championship Wrestling edition from November 2nd, 1985, and whatever passed for standard definition television 30 plus years ago. It's actually funny, too, watching this on Peacock with a much larger screen capture, because the first thing I wrote down in my notes when they got to the promo exchanges was, my God, I never realized just how badly some of these guys were scarred up. Every single one of these guys is just blade job city. Especially the Horsemen, man. Those guys really put a beating on themselves back in the day. So they open up the program with footage of Cornette in the Midnight Express jumping handsome Jimmy Valiant at a live event. And obviously there's a lot of history you can dive into with going back and watching this. Actually, Jim Cornette had a pretty lengthy discussion about where he was around this point in his career, and I think it's actually on YouTube right now. If you just go and search Jim Cornette World Class Championship Wrestling, because 1985 was right around the point where Cornette, Dennis Condrey, and Bobby Eaton had one foot out the door with their falling out with the whole management in World Class. There was the whole drama with the Von Erichs, the Midnight Express Von Erichs tag program that never came to be. They got fed up with it and pretty much left the company within a year. And Cornette had been in contact with Jim Crockett, telling him, yeah, we're pretty much ready to jump ship whenever you guys are. And it wasn't a matter of time before they were all moving up to Charlotte, and their venture with World Class was very short-lived. So, they literally just shown up here in WCW, too. And, well, truth be told, I have absolutely no memory of this rivalry between Jimmy Valiant and the Midnight Express. I remember what it ultimately led to. At Starrcade in late November at the Omni, it ended with Condrey and Eaton wrestling Valiant and Miss Atlanta Lively, who made her presence on the show this week, and I guess I could spoil the whole surprise as to whom Big Mama ended up being revealed as, but For the sake of treating this as a review series, I won't give it away right now, but nevertheless, I had totally cast this program into the memory hole, so to speak. Anyhow, after that brief deal, they cut to the interview booth with Tony Schiavone and David Crockett. And my God, Tony Schiavone in 1985, he is absolutely 1985. That's all I can say about that. Anyway, after the brief nostalgia of reliving Mustache Tony, they recapped the match between Tully Blanchard and Magnum TA for the U.S. heavyweight title in Greensboro. And Tully had essentially laid out some artificially prescribed stipulations that if Magnum didn't beat him, that would be his last title shot. And well, anyone that knows about Magnum TA's tragic car accident story in professional wrestling knows that 1985 was his real last official year in the business before he had to retire for good. And it's such a damn shame going back and reading that car accident story in Charlotte, because growing up, I really never appreciated just how great Magnum was until years later. A true, genuine, and authentic button-down, badass babyface. Anyway, well, this is well into Magnum's feud with the Horsemen by this point. And they're essentially having this 45-minute bloodbath match, or however long they said it was. And they do the deal where Magnum goes to give Tully the atomic drop in the corner. Tully takes the bump into the corner buckle and bounces back and does the double head collision with Magnum. And both guys are laying in dead man's position as the ref counts them both out. And they essentially played up the idea early on in the program that Magnum was SOL when it came to getting another title shot against Tully. But like I said, this played out throughout the show. So our first official match on the program was the Raging Bull Manny Fernandez versus Tommy Lane. Speaking of babyfaces I never valued enough when I was a kid, how about Manny Fernandez? A man who, I believe he is actually still wrestling on the indie circuit, if I'm not mistaken. He's got to be, God, well into his 60s by now, if not pushing 70. Wasn't much of the match itself. Fernandez ended up picking up the win with the Flying Burrito, a finishing move that I am not making up in the slightest. But hey, it was 1985. You could get away with this kind of intolerant humor back then. So after this, we had David Crockett conducting an interview with Ric Flair, brilliantly beginning with the line of, "The man we're intended to respect, the NWA World Champion." And boy, I'll tell you, something very refreshing to hear from wrestling interviewers back in the day when everyone wasn't a goddamn robot reading off a cue card. You want my honest opinion? I think it should be a requirement that every person that gets hired in the business today to conduct backstage interviews watches their fair share of David Crockett interviews. I'm looking at you, WWE. God, Crockett gets the facials down packed, and he's just standing there next to Flair while he's ranting and raving about God knows what. And if you just watch Crockett, he sells it perfectly. He's just fuming, thinking to himself, my God, I wish someone would just pop this clown in the mouth. Absolutely beautiful stuff. Material-wise, I honestly didn't write too much down. I was just so infatuated with just how great David Crockett was, just being disgusted with this heel world champion. Obviously, the central point was around Dusty Rhodes' kayfabe injured ankle, and the doctors had allegedly scheduled his ring return the following day, but Flair basically says there's no way he's going to be able to wrestle because Rick's dad is one of the best physicians in all the land. And he made it clear that there is zero chance that Dusty makes a full recovery by tomorrow. Oh, man. Got to try to avoid geeking out too much for this stuff, but I mean, Jesus Christ, wrestling will never be anything like this ever again. Such a damn shame. And of course, this was followed with Ole and Arn Anderson doing a promo with Tony at the booth, essentially staking the same claim as Flair did. Ain't no way in hell Dusty's going to be medically cleared to compete by tomorrow. And they touched on this later on in the sit down with Tony and one of the medical doctors, but they also played up the story of the steel cast that Dusty would be wearing underneath the boot for reinforcement, which, old trope in the business back in the day. Heels were none too kind when the baby faces got to wrestle with gimmicks, especially casts. I think they did something similar the following year with Ronnie Garvin, if I'm not mistaken. Then we got Buddy Landell versus Tony Zane. Oh my god, Tony Zane. Completely forgot about that guy until this match. Just a frumpy, pudgy-looking goof with no physique and nothing going for him athletically. Just the epitome of the perfect territorial jobber at the time. And nowadays, every jobber in the business has to be some Hot Topic skinny-looking dweeb with terrible Beta Bucks knockoff gear. And worst of all, they actually let these guys get offense in most of the time. Not Tony Zane, though. Nope, Buddy just beat the ever-loving piss out of him. And after he kills this poor bastard, him and J.J. Dillon do a promo on Terry Taylor. And yeah, another match and feud that I have little to no recollection of looking back. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think Buddy Landell was around much longer after Starrcade in 85. I remember Terry Taylor had moved back down to Mid-South by 86. I guess it was UWF by that point. And I can't remember where Landell ended up after this. I'll probably need to look that up for next week's show because I think if I remember this correctly, Landell had wrestled Flair for the world title shortly before this program. And I can't remember if there was like an altercation with him and Flair over a title switch dispute or if it was management that he had a falling out with, but somehow, some way, Landell ended up abruptly leaving the company by the end of the year. But at this point, he's still the national heavyweight champion. And I totally forget who he dropped that belt to, because I know for a fact it wasn't fucking Terry Taylor. Again, like, keep in mind, this is almost 30 years after the fact, Tommy trying to remember all this shit without doing a deep dive into the key programs and stories of 1985 NWA. The Rock and Roll Express doing a brief squash tag against Mike Davis and George South. There's another recurring NWA jobber I have relative memories of. Good old George South. I know Corny talks about him a lot in his classic stories. Not a whole lot to report here. Pretty sure Gibson got the pin, even though he wasn't the legal partner, but it's not like we don't see it every week in modern wrestling. And boy, it is absolutely hysterical hearing people try and attempt to make any modern day comparisons between the Rock and Roll Express and the Beta Bucks in 2021. Show me a wrestling match where the Bucks would even consider winning a tag match with a double drop kick, and I'll at least humor your opinion. Unfortunately, we didn't get a post-match promo from Gibson and Morton this week, but believe you me, I'll have a thing or two to say about the Rock and Roll promos when the time comes. Actually, what was next on the show? My notes got a little scattered at this point, trying to play catch-up. Yeah, I remember where we were. Initially, we had Tully out for a promo with Tony regarding the whole U.S. title picture, and they eventually transitioned over to Bob Siegel making the announcement that the Tully Magnum TA feud has become too personal. Therefore, the National Wrestling Alliance cannot and will not sanction a blow-off between both guys for the belt. And, of course, Tully, being the great dastardly heel he is, goes, "I always knew I liked Bob Siegel. We always saw eye to eye on things." And, there's more to come on this later on, which I'll touch on in a bit, but for sure, I can tell you that one common trope in wrestling that's always seemed to just sort of exist, and it bothered me as a kid growing up, and it bothers me even more today. The standard deal where there's 7 or 8 executives and managers in charge of booking and making decisions, and never being able to decipher who has more power over the other. And believe me, if you watched Nitro a little over a decade later, that was a trope that got old real quick. So we get this match with Billy Jack Haynes versus Black Cat, which, again, another guy in the business that had a real short tenure with the company and a bad reputation with management. I don't remember a single thing that Haynes ever did in the NWA before he got cut. I remember a little bit about his run with the WWF. Obviously, his notable program with Hercules Hernandez at WrestleMania 3. But, yeah, man, another common scenario we used to see back in the day with a lot of constant roster rotation and bad affiliations between talents and management, making for shorter runs and rapid cutoffs. It was a real interesting time back then. So, all right, yeah, this was the point where Tony had to sit down with the medical doctor to talk about Dusty's ankle cast. And they basically spent a few minutes talking about the custom design airtight cast that was supposed to protect against the swelling around Dusty's ankle. Says that the boot company that Dusty worked with out of Austin, Texas, had basically designed a custom steel toe boot with extra reinforcement around the ankles. And once again, the heels had a thing or two to say about that later on. But yeah, that was just the whole segment. Magnum TA won a very quick squash match in just about the amount of time it took for me to type the following sentence. Cool. Back when professional wrestling knew how to do squash matches right. So up next, we were supposed to have an arm wrestling matchup between superstar Billy Graham and the Barbarian, but well, first we got a promo from the man that ultimately became the bane of my childhood existence, Paul Jones, a man that probably embodied the idea of X-Pac heat before that was even a thing. And yeah, he truly was the weasel of professional wrestling when I was a youngling growing up. And now there's plenty more to come with Paul Jones and his crew in the subsequent year, but the interesting thing will be to see whether or not he grows on me in any way as we pick apart the show week by week. To say I was not a particular fan of the Paul Jones saga during this period would be putting it mildly. So, anyway, he comes out and tells Graham that he has to wrestle Abdullah the Butcher before he gets to arm wrestle the Barbarian. And, of course, going into this, there was a $5,000 stake, or a granted stake here. And, Graham's pissed off about this. So they have a match, and I can pretty much chalk it up to they had their best attempt at wrestling a big man match in 1985, which, bluntly put, sucked. Barbarian ends up running in and dropping the elbow on Graham for the DQ. Heels take a minute to lay waste to him until Geeks run out to make the save, which... Not exactly sure how Barbarian and Abdullah were completely incapable of just smashing these morons, but whatever. But really, though, when we're talking about the megastar of this segment, I think we all know who that was. Teddy Long and his receding hairline. Poor Teddy. Been around the business for ages, and no matter what company he was involved with, dude never had a full head of hair anywhere. So... Well, then we had a standby match with Pistol Pez Watley and Benny Traylor because, well, according to the words of Tony and David here, The Billy Graham Abdullah challenge match was scheduled to go 20 minutes, which, like, how exactly they would have known that was supposed to go 20 minutes unless it was an Iron Man match, I have no idea. My God, can you imagine? Superstar Billy Graham and Abdullah the Butcher going Broadway in a 20-minute big man match. Whew. I think I'd rather watch that garbage 8-man main event from Dynamite last week, if I'm being frank. Anyway, so this match with Pez Whatley and Benny Trailer. Yes, Pistol Pez. A man who, well, eventually would turn heel a year later and become good old Shaska Whatley with the Paul Jones Army garbage. And truthfully, was just an excuse to give Jimmy Valiant something to do in his career while it was winding down. But, we'll get to that whole fiasco later, because as great as it is going back and watching some of these retro shows, they're not all going to be enjoyable periods to review, especially the ones that stick with me and leave bad tastes in my mouth. Nothing else to really report on this one. Pez was totally winded about a minute and a half in, and the match unfortunately got some time to it. In fact, most of the match just consisted of Pez lying on the mat with Trailer in a headlock. As you can see, a little bit before the time where guys in the business had completely and totally mastered the 630 corkscrew splash. But give it a couple generations, they got there. We had a hilariously great promo deal with J.J. Dillon and Black Bart. Dillon did some spiel about being ranked 3rd or 4th on the PWI Manager of the Year, which I really didn't care about. But when Black Bart got on the stick and started ranting about this bull rope match deal at Starrcade with Ron Bass, he standing there smacking himself with a cowbell like a deranged lunatic, just howling with laughter. And this coming from Black Bart of all people, who, I mean, definitely was an integral part of the NWA during this period, but, I mean, let's be frank, he wasn't Dusty Rhodes or Tully Blanchard or Arn Anderson by any stretch. Definitely overlooked though in the grand scheme of wrestling history. I think people need to do their research on Black Bart, because he was very underappreciated. Then we had the best thing on the show by a long shot. So Jim Crockett is with Tony, and they're making some match card announcements. And, well, this is the thing I was talking about earlier, where, you know, even as far back during this period in wrestling, we still had the laundry list of executives in charge who were just able to override one another's decisions at the drop of the hat. I mean, at the top of the show, if you recall, President Bob Siegel made the announcement that the NWA refuses to sanction a match between Tully and Magnum TA for the U.S. heavyweight title because, quote, it has now become uncontrollably personal now. And, well, less than 45 minutes later, out comes the owner, Jim Crockett, to book the match for Starrcade anyway. Now, to be fair, this is back when people in the business had a clue and were able to evaluate and explain key factors and storylines. So, Crockett provides an explanation for it, pulls out a contract, apparently for an alleged I Quit rules match that Tully had signed, and for reasons the match never happened or something like that. But it's sort of a proof of validation that Tully was willing to go along with the I Quit stipulation and that he was willing to wrestle Magnum TA. So he books the match for Starrcade. And, I mean, it's a reasonable explanation to a degree, so guess you can't complain about it. So, after Jim Crockett breaks the news of the I Quit cage match for Starrcade between Tully and Magnum TA, Tully comes out for his scheduled match, and he comes barreling toward the interview desk, and clearly I'm going to be paraphrasing some of this verbiage, but his promo was something to the effect of, I can't believe it, I Quit rules, cage match, U.S. title, Ah! And then he bolts to the ring, kills this poor schlub, and David Crockett, the single most underappreciated wrestling commentator of all time, just nonchalantly goes, I think he's mad. Fucking died. And again, because professional wrestling used to be great, and the heels could just still look like jackasses on camera, but still be taken as credible threats, you know what they did here? They didn't bury Tully. Tully didn't go in there and get cradled and pinned like a dweeb in 30 seconds. He was miffed about having to wrestle the match with Magnum, but he didn't let it throw him off his game, because humiliated or not, Tully is still a ruthless ass kicker, and that doesn't stop him from pummeling jobbers in short squash matches. And by the way, I'm going to point this out too. That slingshot suplex that Tully used to do, I mean, I know looking at it in hindsight in 2020, after seeing everything in the kitchen sink probably being done, it doesn't really seem that impressive. But like, keep in mind too, this was during a time where people in the business were naturally bigger dudes. So like, for Tully to be able to hoist up a guy in the air like that and spring him off the ropes for additional leverage, it still takes a considerable amount of strength to pull off. And Tully wasn't necessarily a guy with a jacked physique either. So that was a lot of fun. And speaking of great promos, we had another great raging heel promo from Ole and Arn Anderson. God, wild off-the-wall heel promos. This probably used to be the best parts of wrestling back in the day. You know, back when everyone knew how to cut a fucking promo. Or you just give Sid Vicious and Scott Steiner a live mic and go tell them to make magic. What do we have next? Nikita Koloff killed Mike Jeffers in a short squash match. Of course, this is the period shortly before Koloff started feuding over the United States heavyweight title and started cutting his scathing weekly promos on Magnum TA. And God, it is so funny listening to Ivan and Nikita cut promos in their fake Russian accents. And then you got Crusher Khrushchev just doing his normal Americanized promos. Just total heel goofballs. But still badasses because they didn't lose their matches. And something else I actually forgot about during this period was how early they started planting the seeds for the Flair-Nikita title match for the following year's Starrcade. And again, back when companies used to plot out their feuds 2 to 3 years in advance and have a clear-cut vision of where they wanted to go. And no, don't even try that bullshit argument with me that, well, AEW knows where they want to go 2 to 3 years down the road. They don't have a fucking clue. Cut that shit out. So, and then funny enough, after this, we had Ivan and Crusher against two job guys I didn't even bother writing down. And after they laid waste to them, I actually went back and rewound this to watch it again because I wasn't sure if it was Tony or David that said this, but it turns out it was a fan. Right as Khrushchev sucker punches one of the dweebs in the gut, someone in the audience goes, "He's dead!" God, I miss studio wrestling crowds. Like the real studio wrestling crowds. No offense to the current NWA crowd, but yeah, they're nothing like the old studio audiences from the 80s. And in the main event of the show, again, a story that I have completely and totally wiped from memory, but all centered around this strange, bizarre program with the Midnight Express, Jimmy Valiant, and, well, the individual that showed up in the segment here. So, Jimmy's wrestling a squash match against, I think it was Jimmy Del Rey, if I'm not mistaken. He didn't go by Del Rey here, but pretty sure that's who it was. Anyway, so Valiant's doing all his goofy wrestling, which we'll see plenty more of in 1986, and, you know, doesn't get any less painful to watch for the time. But he's a total gimmick out there, and people love him. That's all I can say about it. Anyway, he's got Del Rey in a neck crank of some sort when all of a sudden a person dressed in drag enters the ring and plunks a huge wet one on Jimmy Valiant. And not a DQ, by the way, even though the ref blatantly saw the run-in. So perhaps there's more than one classic wrestling trope that hasn't died off in the business all these years later. Anyway, so Valiant's practically having an orgasm in the ring while this lady is on the outside. And eventually Valiant gets Del Rey in the ropes. She socks Del Rey in the face to knock him out, which, again, I won't spoil for the sake of story progression, but put two and two together with the whole knockout punch, and you can figure out who that was if you know your NWA history. So Valiant gets the pin, not realizing that the female with the hands of stone just KO'd this poor fucker. And after the match, Cornette's at the interview booth with Tony doing a spiel for a minute. Eventually, Valiant comes back out to run him off the set. And then Valiant spends like the last minute of the show fawning over this dramatic, awkward, tongue-in-the-mouth deal that just took place. Which I have to presume that the individual under this cloaked outfit had a relatively clean-shaven face. Otherwise, I have no idea how Valiant wouldn't have been able to feel the lip hairs on his tongue. Anyway, if you can bypass the absurdity of the whole matter and control your urge to vomit the thought of what ends up getting revealed later on of who the lady actually is, it was a very odd way to go off the air. Oh yeah, and I guess I should point out too that Valiant planted one on Tony right before the end of the show, which, no comment on that. But other than the show going off air by turning into a low rent porno film, I mean, it was a real fun show to go back and watch. And like the funny thing is, if I could be serious for a minute here, the funny thing is, like, if you go back, there were a lot of segments and a lot of ground and material they covered on this show. But if you actually analyze it after the fact, they really only covered maybe 3 or 4 key storylines for the Starrcade pay-per-view. Everything had a purpose. Everything was geared towards building hype for the show. And, aside from the whole makeout session at the end, there was nothing I'd consider irrepressibly stupid. Like, all their champions are made to look credible. Everyone's promos are effective in getting their messages across. The baby faces are treated and work like real baby faces. The heels are treated and work like real heels. Like, is it any wonder I wish professional wrestling would resemble something like this in the modern era? Like, yes, of course the matches aren't necessarily crowd-pleasing spectacles during this period, but they never needed to be. Because they were on TV. They were building hype for the big shows. All they needed to do was construct a card to put over their key stories and characters, elevate the profile of guys they were trying to incrementally build up the card, and give people an incentive to dish out money for the upcoming live shows and pay-per-views. Such a simple fucking formula, and for whatever reason, professional wrestling today often gets it wrong. So, jumping all the way down from Charlotte to the Fritz territory at the Sportatorium in Dallas, Texas, and bouncing back 3 years in the time machine, that takes us to the beginning of our journey with World Class Championship Wrestling from November 6, 1982. And I think I should probably address this right from the jump here, is the people that are asking, well, what exactly drew you to want to go back and go back through the tape library of World Class when Mid-South had a much more national success than World Class, and, the Von Erich territory really ended up turning it out as a niche territory product for the Dallas location without ever expanding beyond that, despite having syndicated television, that whole deal. Because that is a thing I think a lot of people misinterpret when they go back and look at the history of World Class, especially by the time we get to 1985 and they try to go independent, expand their market, and pretty much ended up falling flat on their face. They had generated a lot of success through their broadcast syndication, but even with being able to fill those bigger arenas and selling out tickets left and right and produce a relatively quality looking TV program, especially for this time, it just didn't have the expansive outreach like the other territories did. Like, especially when you compare that with something like Mid-South that was running in God knows how many different states at that time. And, there's a lot to get into with that whole story, but the nutshell version of it is that they essentially got too big for their britches when they split from the National Wrestling Alliance in 85, 86, whichever year it was. They rebranded as the World Class Wrestling Association, and by the time you get to 88, 89, they've merged with Jarrett's Continental Wrestling, and by the following year, that's pretty much a wrap. And again, it's all mostly due to the fact that they just didn't have a broad reach nationwide like I think a lot of people mistake it for. It's really hard to even put it in a modern perspective to even compare it to things like Ring of Honor or Impact Wrestling, because even World Class back in 82 was a much bigger attraction than ROH or Impact by a wide margin. But my thought going back and looking at it is, well, the talent crossover between Mid-South, and even when they rebranded as a UWF a year later in 86, a lot of a close association with WCW around that time. And I don't want the review series to essentially come across as an extension of the same territory in separate locations. And even though World Class wasn't necessarily a product that I'd say I had a religious appeal to back in the day, it was an integral territorial product, even though, like I said earlier, it really was a much smaller niche product on a lesser national scale. And with me starting my NWA WCW review series from November of 85, by this point, World Class had disbanded from the National Wrestling Alliance altogether, so it is essentially like I'm reviewing two completely separate products by this point. So our opening match here is the handicap match with the Great Kabuki taking on Simone and Raul Castro, which ended up being elimination style rules. And just to give a quick history lesson, again, for those that need it, you'll probably come to learn very soon that a lot of these retro shows are going to have a significant amount of history lessons strewn throughout. The Great Kabuki was a Gary Hart creation, specifically for World Class. Had probably one of the coolest looking entrance masks. It was essentially one of those creepy, devilish looking dragon masks wrapped around a giant headgear. And he ended up being, I think, the first wrestler, if I'm not mistaken, to do the whole colored mist gimmick. And what was really cool about the mask is that he was able to blow the mist through the mouth of the mask. Just made for a great visual. And they actually ended up using him as a plot device down the road when the Great Muta debuted for Jim Crockett Promotions in 89, because he was managed by Gary Hart at that point too, and they billed Muta as the son of Kabuki with the mist gimmick and everything. Now, of course, the mist in professional wrestling means about as much as a headlock takeover, but what can you do? But now the match was just a squash deal to get Kabuki over, using the interesting finisher of driving his opponent's leg into the mat. And apparently this was a submission move during this time, because the Castros took a pair of those leg drives into the mat before giving up and the ref calling for the bell. Interesting stuff. And I would absolutely be lying to you if I could tell you where Kabuki ended up storyline-wise by this point in 82, so this will definitely be where the retro review carries its advantages, where I get to go back and figure out where a lot of these guys ended up, or in some cases didn't end up. So up next, we were supposed to get Terry Gordy and Michael Hayes of the Freebirds against Grand Marcus and the Destroyer, the ultimate job squad duo for the Freebirds here. But before that, Bill Irwin and King Kong Bundy were out to get the jump on Gordy and Hayes. And they spent about 5 minutes doing a mass brawl with everyone running in, trying to separate everyone. They got cops out there trying to hold people back. The crowd's just going nuts for all this stuff, by the way. Like back when chaotic brawls weren't done 22 times in one show and they actually had weight to them. So, finally, the official David Manning lays down the law. A man that I have no recollection of at all, but this is also during a period where the officials could actually enforce the rules and threaten guys with bounties and fines. So he tells the heels to hit the bricks, otherwise they'd be fined $500 each. And if we ever saw something like this in the modern era again, I think I'd have a newfound respect for wrestling officials. Unfortunately, I watch AEW every week where, possibly with the exception of Aubrey, every referee on that show is blind, deaf, and dumb. So, coming back from the break, we do get the tag match, and they have a fun little match with the Freebirds just run wild on these two goons for a while. Good old chance of go, Terry, go, despite the fact that he was on offense when the crowd was chanting this. Which, boy, it'll be a cold day in hell before we ever get chants like that in professional wrestling again. The heels did get a brief heat sequence on Hayes, but Gordy ended up hoisting up Marcus for the spike piledriver finish, and afterwards Hayes got on the mic and basically said they were going to lay the beating down to Bundy and Irwin. Had a recovery update sit down with Kerry Von Erich and Bill Mercer. Kerry talks about being mentally prepared to get back in the ring with Flair, who, keep in mind, is the NWA World Champion at this time. And Mercer plays some footage of Flair disrespecting Kerry and basically blowing him off as a credible challenger. And pretty much says by the end that the war is on between him and Flair. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but this was sort of a continuation of the 1982 program with Flair and Kerry, which I know they end up doing a cage match at one point, but I can't remember if that was a blow-off or not. It might have been. I'll have to look that up later. I don't remember off the top of my head. Up next, it's the Magic Dragon and Checkmate versus Bugsy McGraw and Al Madrill. Oh, man. Going back and watching Bugsy in action. Boy, was that guy a character. I guess if you want to put it in comparison to the two shows, kind of the Jimmy Valiant comparison of world class for this time. A total wacky gimmicks straight out of Curly of the Three Stooges, but I'll be damned if the guy wasn't over like crazy in the Dallas region. And, this is definitely a gimmick match. Not in the sense of the use of weaponry or anything, but watching Bugsy in there working like a total goofball is just... It worked for its time. That's all I can say about it. And whereas nowadays, guys try to do over-the-top comedy, and most of the time it sucks because it's all comedy and no wrestling. This is an example where Bugsy can do silly things like, trying to flip-flop on the mat in order to break Checkmate's turtle shell cover-up position he was doing, but still resembles something involving wrestling. Or like the spot where Checkmate's covered up in a ball on the mat and Bugsy goes down to do the same thing, and both are just kind of laying there on the mat for a while, and then you kind of see Bugsy look out of the corner of his eye waiting for Checkmate to make a move. Like, that's the kind of stuff that usually wouldn't jive well with me, but when it's done in moderation and it's not over-the-top cartoony, it's fine. Just so you don't get the impression that I hate comedy in wrestling. I'll actually tell you what my favorite spot of this match was. It was the finishing deal where they're doing the do-si-do Irish whip exchanges. And in the first go-around, the jobbers do it to Bugsy and Madrill, and they turn around and clothesline them. And like a minute later, they try a role reversal, but the faces still turn around and deck the jobbers with the same clothesline. That was great. Things kind of broke down at the end. Somehow Madrill ended up hitting a diving crossbody for the 3, which was also kind of funny because if you watch the tape back, Bugsy sort of paintbrushes the ref with his boot trying to block the breakup. And if this ref's head was like a quarter of an inch above where it was on the mat, he probably would have gotten his head kicked off. But, yeah, fun little TV match. And again, man, watching the fans react to this thing is totally out of this world. They got multiple camera angles filming these people's reactions, and they are so into this shit. And the great thing is, like, there's nothing fake about it at all. And that was just kind of like a testament to just how different professional wrestling fans were back then. They're just ordinary people, most of whom probably had normal, boring lives with normal, boring day-to-day jobs. And they just bought tickets to see some pro wrestling and see their guys win. Like a totally different field and fan base compared to what we have now. And like whether you consider that for better or worse, one thing I can tell you for sure is that even as far back in the 80s, wrestling crowds had a totally different vibe than they do now. And our big featured match for the night was Kevin Von Erich and Wild Bill Irwin. And first thing I wrote down in my notes here, what a great physique Kevin Von Erich had. Great look, great athleticism, someone that would be able to fit right in with the modern era if he was in his prime still. And, obviously I could go into a whole hour-long spiel about the Von Erich family, but I think Dark Side of the Ring series covers the Von Erich stories relatively well. I think one of the big things people still wonder about years later is, had the Von Erichs been able to branch out as stars beyond just the Dallas territory, which they never really had the opportunity to do, except for Kerry when he went to the WWF, and we all remember how that played out when Vince got a hold of him. But it is an interesting question. I've always been of the opinion that while Kevin Von Erich was probably the one I consider the most athletically gifted, the more I think about it, I think Jim Cornette is right with his judgment that Kerry probably would have been the megastar had he been given a real break. David Von Erich, I think most people associated him as the guy that just had a more natural ability to talk. And while Kerry was a good promo for his time, I think David's promos had more oomph to them. Like, he just had more bass in his voice than Kerry did. The other thing David had going for him, too, was size. When you think back in retrospect, had David not passed away suddenly in 1984, would Vince have eventually tried to pick him up at some point? And I think there's a case to be made for that. Even at that point, I wouldn't have had enough confidence that Vince would have ever pushed him beyond a certain limit, just based on name value and the fact that David was already sort of a household name by his own right. But we all know Vince is a traditionalist when it comes to big guys in pro wrestling, so it is conceivable to imagine that if David had been alive during the late 80s and early 90s, he may have wound up finding himself in WWF somehow. Obviously, Kevin's story is a little different, seeing as how he's the only one of the original second-generation patriarch family to still be alive. And obviously, Kevin's sons are still wrestling, and I think they're in MLW right now, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember Lacey tried out professional wrestling in the late 2000s, but she didn't last all that long before she retired. But it is great to see the family legacy still being carried through years later. And the match itself was a lot of fun, even though the finish sucked a cock. They were like a minute into this thing when the people started chanting, "We want the claw," which was kind of funny. Most of the match, though, was just Kevin out-wrestling Irwin from start to finish. They did a brief heat sequence toward the end, but Kevin ended up catching Irwin in the abdominal stretch, and that is when Irwin, I think, ended up grabbing the official as all three guys went down on the mat, and that's when they rang the bell, and Kevin won by DQ. And, of course, they come back from break, and Bill Mercer and Jay Solid are at the desk recapping the program and kind of laying out the gauntlet for what they can expect down the road. And yeah, that's another aspect of pro wrestling I wish would kind of come back. Like the show recaps from the announced teams where everyone just sort of takes a couple minutes to give their input and, lay out what they perceive is going to happen in the coming weeks. Like everything is so damn crash TV now. You don't make time for subtle things that could actually really add layers to the show in positive ways. Just very simple, effective things like having all the announcers recap the show and give their various opinions on all the programs. I mean, at least in that sense, it would give you a rhyme and a reason to go with babyface and heel commentators, because then you can have the heels give their biased opinions in favor of the bad guys, and the play-by-play babyface announcers giving their input from a more rational point of view, like that kind of thing. But yeah, it was a fun 45 minutes of wrestling content. And obviously, as you can see from the key points on this show, World Class Championship Wrestling was pretty much all centered around two key teams, the Freebirds and the Von Erichs. Those were the guys that were the most over, the guys that pretty much carried the torch for the territory. And well, if you know your world class history, you know what comes by the end of the year with those two teams. And obviously Flair is still an integral part of the product by this point, but much like NWA WCW, there's a very select group of guys they're featuring, but everyone gets time. They put over the significance of the key stories. Everything has something of value. And this is well before the term filler material was ever mouthed in the business, much less thought up of. Fun show, though. And, I think with it only being 45 minutes, the shows will be far easier to watch and sit through going forward. And, I'll try to do more research with the timeline here just so I kind of know what we're building towards with the top programs, because, there are aspects of me that want to wait and hold off to see where things go, but having a little bit of hindsight would also kind of help with the formatting and make it for a more pleasurable viewing experience. Anyway, guys, that'll do it for this edition of the 5 Starr Wrestling Report. Holy shit, this is a long show this week. But hopefully this new format, works and finds itself as a proper substitute for NXT. I had a lot of fun talking about this stuff, and I just really haven't found a lot of appeal out of NXT in a while. So, and I mean, it doesn't seem like anyone else has a real attraction to that show one way or the other at this point anyway. I think the bloom's pretty much off the rose with that show now. If you want to stay posted with future FSWR content, make sure you subscribe, comment, and rate the show. I will be back on Monday for our next installment of the 5 Starr Wrestling Report, where we look at AEW Rampage, NWA Power, and my most recent Chairshot publication, all centered around WWE and what many people effectively refer to as the 4 Horsewomen. And we will be exploring the current status of the women's division in WWE and whether or not 2022 needs some new focal points in the women's scene that doesn't involve Sasha, Becky, Bayley, or Charlotte. But that is for Monday. Until then, all, peace out.